On the evening of November 10th, 1975, Captain Bernie Cooper stood on the bridge of the SS Arthur M. Anderson, his knuckles white as he gripped the radio handset. Just before 7 p.m., he'd radioed his fellow captain, Ernest McSorley, aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald to warn him about two massive waves that had just crashed over the Anderson's deck. Waves so powerful they damaged a lifeboat and sent dark green water cascading over the bridge deck, 35 feet above the waterline. "We are holding our own," McSorley replied, his voice crackling through the static. Those would be the last words anyone would hear from the Edmund Fitzgerald. At 7:15 p.m., the massive freighter, 729 feet long, carrying 26,000 tons of iron ore, vanished from the Anderson's radar screen. She was gone, all 29 crew members with her. Whitefish Bay, a safe haven from the storm, was just 17 miles away. What happened in those final 15 minutes? 50 years later, the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald remains one of the most controversial and debated maritime disasters in Great Lakes history. But this wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a disaster Captain McSorley could have prevented. Hello, and welcome to Deadliest Disasters. November 9th, 1975. The Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with taconite pellets bound for Detroit. Captain Ernest McSorley was at the helm, a veteran of the Great Lakes with decades of experience. Following behind was the Arthur M. Anderson, captained by Jesse Bernie Cooper. The two ships would stay in radio contact throughout the journey, their paths intertwined in what would become one of the worst storms Lake Superior had ever seen. By the morning of November 10th, the weather had turned savage. This wasn't just a storm, it was a meteorological monster. The National Weather Service would later run computer simulations showing that two separate areas of high-speed wind appeared over Lake Superior at 4 p.m. that day. One had speeds exceeding 43 knots, the other over 40 knots. By evening, winds would reach near hurricane force, 70 mile per hour sustained, with gusts up to 86 miles per hour. Bernie Cooper and Ernest McSorley stayed in constant radio contact as the wind picked up through the morning. By afternoon, the conditions were apocalyptic. Gusts of wind 90 miles per hour whipped snow into blinding squalls. Waves swelled at heights of 25 to 35 feet and crashed over both ships with such magnitude that Cooper would later report up to 12 feet of water accumulating on his deck. Computer analysis later showed that average wave heights reached near 19 feet by 7 p.m., with the largest waves, those statistical outliers, reaching up to 36 feet. And 1 in every 1,000 waves could potentially reach 46 feet in height. At 3:20 p.m., trouble began. McSorley's voice came over the radio with troubling news. The Fitzgerald had sustained damage. A fence rail on the deck had been snapped. 2 vents on the ballast tanks were broken and damaged. And most concerning of all, the ship had developed a starboard list, tilting to one side. McSorley told Cooper his pumps were running. For a ship's captain to report running pumps means one thing: water is coming in where it shouldn't be. The Fitzgerald, the pride of the Great Lakes fleet, the ship so grand they called her the pride of the American side, was taking on water. The ship wasn't falling apart, not yet, but these were ominous signs. The massive storm was taking its toll. Every time a swell rose, the Fitzgerald would drop off the Anderson's radar. Then, the Fitzgerald's own radar malfunctioned, leaving McSorley essentially blind in the storm. He made the decision to slow his ship so that Anderson could catch up and keep visual track of him. Bernie Cooper watched from the Anderson, miles behind, as the Fitzgerald rode lower and lower in the water. Each wave that crashed over her deck stayed there longer than it should have. The ship's freeboard, the distance from the waterline to the deck, was decreasing. She was getting heavier, more sluggish, and more vulnerable with each passing hour. Just before 7 p.m., 2 massive waves, possibly members of what Great Lakes sailors call the Three Sisters, crashed over the Anderson's bow. The first wave flooded their boat deck with such force it pushed a lifeboat down into its saddles hard enough to damage the bottom. The second wave was even more terrifying. It sent green, unbroken water over the Andersons' bridge deck, 35 feet above the waterline. Cooper immediately grabbed the radio. Those waves were rolling directly toward the Fitzgerald. He needed to warn McSorley. "How are you making out?" Cooper asked. "We are holding our own," McSorley replied. The Andersons' radar showed the Fitzgerald disappearing once again into a wave trough. They waited for her to reappear on the screen, but she never did. The Edmund Fitzgerald had plunged to the bottom of Lake Superior in a matter of seconds, so quickly that no distress call was sent, so quickly that no lifeboats were deployed, and so quickly that 29 men never had a chance. In May 1976, 6 months after the Fitzgerald disappeared beneath the waves, the U.S. Navy found her remains in 530 feet of water, broken into 2 large pieces. The bow section, 276 feet long, stood upright in the mud as if it had plowed into the lake bottom at full speed. The stern, 253 feet long, lay capsized at a 50-degree angle, only 170 feet away. Between them lay a massive scatter field of taconite pellets, hatch covers, and hull plating. But after review, the U.S. Coast Guard's Marine Board of Investigation concluded they could not determine the proximate cause with certainty. But they, along with the National Transportation Safety Board, pointed their fingers at one primary culprit: the hatches. According to the Coast Guard's investigation, the most probable cause of Edmund Fitzgerald's sinking was, quote, massive flooding of the cargo hold through ineffective hatch closures, unquote. On the Edmund Fitzgerald's deck, approximately 68 clamps secured the hatch covers over the cargo hold. In the violence of that storm, with waves constantly washing over the deck, if those hatches weren't properly secured or if they failed under the onslaught, water would pour directly into the cargo hold. The NTSB went further, stating the probable cause was the sudden massive flooding of the cargo hold due to the collapse of one or more hatch covers. And here's where it gets worse. A seasoned mariner named George Red Bergner served as a cook on the Fitzgerald for 10 years and was the ship's winter keeper for 7 years. In a January 1978 deposition, Bergner testified that the Fitzgerald frequently left port without fully securing all 68 clamps on the hatch covers. The practice was apparently common enough that he felt compelled to mention it under oath. He said Captain McSorley did not want to pay his men overtime to properly secure the clamps. He felt comfortable getting it partly secured. As the flooding progressed throughout November 10th, the ship lost more and more freeboard, riding lower in the water. Each wave hit harder, and each wave lingered longer on the deck. Finally, as the storm reached peak intensity, the bow pitched down into a wall of water and could not recover. Within seconds, 26,000 tons of cargo rushed forward, the bow plowed into the lake bottom, and the midship structure disintegrated. The stern section, suddenly emptied of cargo, rolled over and came to rest upside down atop the disintegrated middle section. This was a very plausible theory, but not everyone agrees. Bernie Cooper, the man who spent those final hours in radio contact with McSorley, believed something else happened. In his handwritten account written about 10 years after the disaster, Cooper wrote, quote, "The Fitz was to the west of our course line, maybe too close to Caribou Island," unquote. Cooper believed the Fitzgerald had grounded on a shoal, specifically 6 Fathom Shoal, near Caribou Island, where bedrock ridges take lake depths to 36 feet or even shallower. For a deep drafting vessel like the Fitzgerald loaded with 26,000 tons of cargo, that could be catastrophic. Cooper's theory is supported by the timeline. At 3:20 p.m., McSorley reported the damage: snapped railings, broken vents, a list, and running pumps. Cooper wrote, quote, "Probably a fracture of the hull. At this time, the Fitz was mortally wounded. How bad we wouldn't know until later. My own opinion is that she bottomed out on a shoal," unquote. Cooper noted that the area hadn't been surveyed since 1915. Indeed, after the Fitzgerald sank, the Canadian government updated its maps in 1976 and discovered the shoal was actually about 1 mile further east than previously charted. Robert Thibodeau, who spent 45 years as a Great Lakes mariner and retired as captain of the longest freighter on the lakes, agrees with Cooper. He believes that Fitzgerald got too close to that 36-foot shoal, and even if she was in technically navigable water, the massive waves from the storm could have thrust her bottom into the bedrock. But here's the problem. There's no evidence. Rick Mixter, a shipwreck historian and one of the few people to have dived the wreck, has totally ruled out running aground. Naval architects Sean Carey and Ben Fisher, in their 2012 forensic analysis, pointed out there's no sign of grounding damage to the exposed stern section, which would have been the deepest part of the ship in the water and the first to hypothetically strike the shoal. And then there's the insult to the crew. 4 men aboard the Fitzgerald that night, including McSorley and 3 mates, had attained master designation from the Coast Guard, the highest maritime certification. They'd made that turn around Caribou Island hundreds of times. John Simmons, the wheelsman, had been on the Fitzgerald since 1959. As Rick Mixter puts it, quote, "To insult those guys, to say they cut that corner and ran to ground, is absolutely silly," unquote. But this is where Captain McSorley's decisions become crucial and deeply troubling. Red Bergner didn't just testify about loose hatch clamps. He also testified about something far more serious. The Edmund Fitzgerald had recurring problems with a loose keel. The keel is the steel backbone of the ship, running along the bottom from which the entire hull is constructed. If your keel is compromised, your entire ship is compromised. Bergner stated he observed the loose keel as recently as the winter of 1973, receiving only tack welds instead of solid continuous welds to reattach it. He testified under oath that the Fitzgerald would move and heave with large waves in a way he'd never experienced on other boats. She took longer to straighten out after waves hit, and she made groaning noises, sounds Bergner said he'd never heard on any other vessel. But the most damning testimony came next. Bergner stated he was present for a conversation in early 1975 as the Fitzgerald was being prepared for the shipping season. Maintenance workers came into the mess room and sat down with coffee. They turned to Captain McSorley. One of them said, quote, "Captain, the keel's loose on this son of a bitch again," unquote. According to Bergner's sworn testimony, McSorley replied, quote, "I don't give a F. All this son of a bitch has to do is stay together 1 more year. After that, I don't give a shit what happens to it," end quote. Hearing that, especially with what we know now, is damning. The captain of the ship knew there was a structural problem with the keel, the backbone of his vessel, and he chose to sail anyway. Through 5 gale force winds that season, 1 on Lake Huron, 4 on Superior. Each storm, as Mixter points out, would have loosened the keel even more. Bergner's testimony is corroborated by Joseph E. Fisher, a marine engineer and naval architect. Fisher recalled that in 1969, his company was asked to investigate some of the continuing failures of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Each year, surveys would show cracks in the weld. Each year, they'd be rewelded, and each year, the same cracks would reappear again. The ship had a chronic structural flaw, and everyone seemed to know it. Another theory is what sailors on Lake Superior call the Three Sisters. This is a sequence of 3 rogue waves, each at least 1/3 larger than the surrounding waves. The first wave dumps an abnormally large amount of water onto the deck. Before it can drain away, the second wave strikes, adding to the surplus. The third wave compounds the problem, quickly overloading the deck with more water than it could handle. Bernie Cooper reported that his ship was hit by 2 30 to 35-foot waves around 6:30 p.m. One buried the aft cabins. The second came over the bridge deck. Cooper believed a third wave may have followed, and that these waves continued into the direction of the Fitzgerald, striking her around the time she sank. In 2010, the National Research Council's wave-generating tank in St. John's simulated the effect of a 56-foot rogue wave on a scale model of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The simulation showed such a wave could almost completely submerge either the bow or the stern of the ship, at least temporarily. For a ship already listing, already riding low from taking on water, and already damaged from hours of pounding, a sequence of rogue waves could have been the final blow. But shipwreck expert Rick Mixter believes the answer isn't just one theory, it's all of them working together in a cascading failure. The Fitzgerald entered the storm with a compromised keel that had been cracking and failing for years. The violent seas loosened it further. The damaged vents at 3:20 p.m. allowed water into the ballast tanks, and the ship began listing and riding lower. The forward house flooded, and more water accumulated on deck because the ship was moving too slowly and riding too low for it to drain properly. Then came the waves Cooper warned about. 2 or 3 massive walls of water, possibly the Three Sisters. They collapsed hatches number 1 and 5. Water rushed into the cargo hold, and the ship could not recover. According to Mixter's theory, the Fitzgerald broke her back on the surface, the hull girder finally failing after years of cracking and one too many storms. She dove underneath the water, the stern section ripped off, and flipped upside down. This theory aligns with the 2012 forensic analysis by Carey and Fisher. Damaged vents flooding ballast tanks, forward house flooding, forward hatch covers blown in, cascading water ingress, and finally, hull girder failure. The Navy's positioning of the wreck supports a surface breakup. The bow section plowed into the bottom at speed while still attached to the stern. Then the midships disintegrated and the stern capsized nearby. If the ship had broken apart on the surface of the water and the sections had remained buoyant even briefly, the 50-knot winds would have carried them much further apart. And all of this brings us back to Ernest McSorley. By all accounts, he was an experienced captain, but experience does not always equal good judgment. Captain McSorley knew about the keel problems. According to Bergner's testimony, he knew in early 1975 and chose to sail anyway, making a callous comment about the ship just needing to last, quote, 1 more year. He then piloted that compromised vessel through 5 gale force storms in a single season, compromising his ship more and more. On November 10th, after reporting damage at 3:20 p.m., the snapped railings and broken vents, a list, and running his pumps, McSorley could have made for shelter. He could have turned toward Whitefish Bay earlier. He could have tried to get his men to safety, but instead he pressed on. McSorley reportedly told Cooper he was in some of the worst seas he'd ever seen, and yet even then he continued. The Coast Guard report noted, quote, "It is probable that, at the time he reported this, Fitzgerald had lost so much freeboard from the flooding of the cargo hold that the effect of the sea was much greater than he would have ordinarily experienced," unquote. McSorley was a veteran who had likely developed what psychologists call normalization of deviance, a phenomenon where people become so accustomed to operating in risky conditions that those conditions start to feel normal and acceptable. The keel had been cracking for years, and nothing catastrophic had happened yet. He'd sailed through storms before and made it through. Why would this time be different? But this time was different. The storm was worse, and the ship more compromised. The seas were more violent, and the margin for error had finally run out. 28 men paid the price for decisions they had no part in making, and only one man was to blame. But he laid on the cold bottom of Lake Superior with his crew that he doomed to their graves. The legal fallout was swift. 2 widows filed a $1.5 million lawsuit against Edmund Fitzgerald's owners, Northwestern Mutual, and its operators, Ogle Bay Norton Corporation, just 1 week after she sank. Additional lawsuits totaling $2.1 million followed. Ogle Bay Norton filed a petition seeking to limit their liability to just $817,920. The company eventually paid compensation to surviving families about 12 months before official findings were released, and the company required confidentiality agreements as a condition of payment. Journalist Robert Hemming later reasoned that the Coast Guard's conclusions, quote, were benign in placing blame on neither the company nor the captain, and saved the Oglebay Norton from very expensive lawsuits by the families of the lost crew," unquote. Did the official investigations avoid assigning blame to protect corporate interests? We may never know for certain. 50 years later, the Edmund Fitzgerald still holds her secrets. Rick Mixter believes we could solve many of these remaining mysteries with modern technology. A sonar scan with current equipment could reveal details impossible to see in previous scans. But there's been resistance to further investigation, partly from families who want their loved ones' graves left undisturbed, and partly from a culture that views the wreck as sacred ground. Mixter said, quote, "Many of the voices that were so vocally opposed to us have faded since they have passed away. 50 years later now, we are sitting at the point where there is better technology and we could figure it out," unquote. The Edmund Fitzgerald didn't sink because of one failure. She sank because of a cascade of failures, structural problems ignored for years, a careless captain who had poor reasoning and should have been forced out of his position, hatch covers that may or may not have been properly secured, and a freakish storm that generated near hurricane force winds, with waves as tall as buildings. On the night of November 10th, 1975, Bernie Cooper stood on the bridge of the Anderson and watched his radar screen, waiting for the Fitzgerald to reappear. But she never did. In his handwritten account, you could sense his grief and his guilt, the survivor's burden of wondering if there was anything more he could have done. The Edmund Fitzgerald went down with all 29 hands, and not one body was ever recovered. The bell of the Edmund Fitzgerald was retrieved in 1995 and is now on display at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum with the crew members' names engraved on it. A new bell engraved with the names was left on the wreck as a memorial. Should we investigate further, or should we let the Fitzgerald and her crew rest in peace? That's something I'm torn on, but ultimately, I think we have enough knowledge of the wreck to come to a conclusion about why it sank and how it could have been prevented.